Hello. We're doing infections and the cause of infections today. Infections mean anytime your body is invaded by some kind of a foreign organism. So an injury isn't an infection. It's an infection if bacteria, viruses, fungi, or something like that comes in. First of all, bacteria, not viruses, but bacteria have an interesting relationship with humans. We have a normal flora, meaning the bacteria that are normally growing within us, mostly in the GI tract, some in the airways, and some of these are very beneficial. Our microbiome is a group of bacteria in the GI tract that help us digest our food and help us to control outside bacteria that may come in. Some of our normal bacteria could be harmful, but they're kept in check by our other bacteria and other mechanisms, and as a result, they only burst forth if something goes wrong. A number of microorganisms can be said to be opportunistic. We have MRSA on our skin. We have E. coli on our hands. We have staph and strep bacterium on our skin, and yet our own defense mechanisms keep us healthy unless something goes wrong, in which case suddenly, opportunistically, they're able to jump in and take over where they couldn't before. So here's some different concepts regarding these guys to see how likely they are to cause disease. Communicability is the first one. How easy it is for me to pass it to somebody else is its communicability. Measles is very easy to give to somebody, a cold. If you sneeze in the room, if you shake hands with them, you're likely to give them the disease. HIV, for instance, is on the opposite end of the scale. It's really hard to transmit. You have to transmit certain bodily fluids, blood, semen, and almost even then, often you have to have a little tear or cut in the lining of the vagina or on the skin or something, or actually accidentally inject yourself before you could catch IV. So it's not very communicable. Virulence is how bad it's going to make you sick. I mean, when you get measles, you get a certain amount of sick. When you get a cold, you get a certain amount of sick. Flu is more virulent than a cold. Rabies, very virulent. If you don't get treated for rabies, you die. It's almost nobody who's gone untreated and gotten rabies has survived it, like maybe 5 people in history. Infectivity is how easy it is for that pathogen to move into the cells in your body. The mechanism of action is important. Viruses like to go into the nucleus and screw around with your DNA. Bacteria sometimes eat your cells. Sometimes they inject cytotoxins. Sometimes they cause your own immune system to attack your own cells. Sometimes they just cause an immune response that gives you a lot of inflammation. So there are different mechanisms by which these pathogens can cause problems. Portal of entry is important. Do you get it when somebody sneezes in your face? Can you get it from shaking hands? Can you get it from sitting on a seat that somebody has sat in that has the flu? Or do you have to actually get it through direct exchange of bodily fluids? Inhalation, ingestion, some you might get just from eating something. Bad food may have some bacteria that makes you really sick. It could arrive via a vector, an animal or insect bite. Rabies, animal bites, a lot of viruses are carried by mosquitoes. They're considered the vector for those diseases. And we have a lot of different microorganisms. all are which are happy to do us ill if they get the chance. We have viruses. We'll talk about them. They're almost separate. They're almost like they're not alive. They are so primitive that they don't meet the criteria of living things all that much. Bacteria, remember those are prokaryotes. They're very simple, but they're actually considered a real life form. They can replicate on their own and so forth. We have gram-negative and gram-positive. Remember, the gram-negatives are tougher because they have an outer shell that prevents them from staining, and so they are negative to that gram stain, and they're a little bit harder to kill. Fungi, protozoa, actually single-celled animals. Chlamydia, it's a specific type of bacterium. Rickettsia is like a pre-bacteria of some kind. It's its own little type of subcategory. Mycoplasma, especially, it's the same as this. It's really a bacterium, but it's different than the host of other bacterium, strep and staph, and the ones that we're used to seeing. Mycoplasma is a little bit different. It's the one that gives you what we call walking pneumonia or community-acquired pneumonia. And helminths are worms. They are parasites. They're a little bit more complicated. Some of them are pretty big, but they're multi-celled animals that get inside you. Sometimes you can ingest them. You might get a fly or something that lays eggs in your skin, under your skin, and they hatch under there and give you worms. So look at our gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. I mentioned them briefly. They're called that because there's a gram staining process that is used for fungi and bacteria and stuff, but there are a couple of different kinds of bacteria, and if the gram stain goes in, it turns you bright purple. If it can't go in, you don't turn purple. And gram-negative bacteria don't stain. And that's because they have that tough outer shell that prevents the stain from getting in. It's also a defense mechanism against your own white blood cells that may be trying to attack them. They're more resistant to antibiotics. Here's a gram-positive. Look, the stain went right in. Made them really nice and bright. These rod things here. These are your cells. They stain gram-positive too because they don't have a coating on the outside, a tough coating. But these rod-like bacteria have stained. These have not. And I couldn't get the same magnification, but these little rod-like guys didn't turn purple. So they're gram-negatives. A variety of worm-like creatures can invade you. Everything from a hookworm to a tapeworm. Some of these things can be 6 feet long. They can be really, really grim to watch somebody be dewormed. Even their dog or cat being dewormed is kind of a difficult thing to watch. But these guys will invade. Some of them will live in muscle. They'll live in skeletal muscle, in your heart muscle. A lot of them do like to live, some will live under your skin. A lot of them do like to live in your GI tract. They eat your food and they eat you. A lot of them are blood suckers. Now, the organisms that are trying to kill us are good at defending themselves against us. That's why it's so hard for our body to fight off these infections without help sometimes, and why before the onset of antibiotics, people died from infections all the time. They just couldn't quite defeat the bacteria. The surface coats that prevent your binding of antibodies, the ability of a white blood cell to actually eat it, be like eating a boulder that was half the size of of your own cell to begin with. And that's true especially of gram-negatives. And viruses have a tendency, well, first of all, they go into your cell to do their job in the first place. Once they're inside your cells, your neutrophils can't attack them. They'll only attack them when they come back out again to go to other cells. So they can hide sometimes for years and years, and then come back out again. And they also they morph. They mutate into a different form. So they'll go in the cell, they'll take some of your DNA, they'll change themselves into something slightly different, they come back out again, and you don't recognize them right away. And by the time you've built up immunity to those guys, they're back in the cells, they're mutating and coming back out again. Now, this is one problem with HIV. It spends a lot of time in the cells, and it mutates enough that it's hard for your body to mount a decent defense against it. It's also the reason why we need a new flu shot every year, because the flu virus from this year changes enough to next year that your body won't recognize it as being the same one, so whatever immunity you've built up against it won't do you any good. There are a variety of ways that bacteria can hurt you. They can, like I said, they can actually eat some of your tissues. But one thing they do usually is they kill your cells before they eat them, or they just kill them, as part of their overall process. And what they produce are toxins that kill the cell. Either kill it from the outside or from within, in the cell walls inside the cytosol, which do enough damage to the cell mechanism that it causes the cell to die. Cytotoxins means kill cells. Neurotoxins kill nerves or cause them to malfunction. Pneumotoxins, lungs. Enterotoxins, GI tract. Hemolysins, these break down blood cells, cause your blood cells to dissolve. They release things that cause pyrogenic effects and give you a fever. Now, once again, the initial idea of a fever is to protect you against these guys because they don't like hot temperatures. And so they aren't trying to give you a fever. Your body recognizes they're there, recognizes these pyrogens that are released by these guys or by your own cells when they're attacking them and killing them, and as a result, the hypothalamus causes your temperature to go up so that you can fight them easier. And most infections, bacterial infections, tend to be in tissues. You cut yourself, bacteria get in. And they're not in the blood initially, they're in the tissue. And therefore your white blood cells have to cross the capillary wall and get into the tissue and eat the guys to do what they have to do. If bacteria make it into the bloodstream, it's bad. Then the infection has spread. It's almost like it is metastasized from the location where it started, so now it can spread throughout the body. Bacteremia, emia means in the blood, like anemia, not enough blood. So bacteremia means there's bacteria in the blood. Septicemia means it's flourishing and growing there and increasing in number, which is a life-threatening condition. So if you don't kill the guys while they're in the tissue and they manage to migrate through the membranes into the bloodstream, you have bacteremia, septicemia. It's usually the gram-negatives because your body has a harder time killing them in the first place. This septicemia in particular, one of the things that bacteria do is they set off this inflammatory response If it's in my arm swells up. If it's in my entire blood system, all of my blood vessels dilate, my blood pressure drops so low it kills me. Endotoxic shock. Here's a couple of nice infections. Probably a staph infection there, bacterial infection, localized to that area. Here's the whole, lower part of the limbs here has a bacterial infection. Now, viruses are a bit different. Viruses have a tendency to go into the bloodstream from the beginning, so they kind of go widespread. They move across the membranes, they move into cells and do their dastardly work inside of your cells. Viruses cannot replicate on their own. A virus, that's why they're almost not a critter. They're almost not a creature. They can't actually divide and multiply. What they have to do is go inside your cells, steal your DNA or steal your RNA so that they can replicate themselves. Then they come back out and go to other cells and come back out and go to other cells until they spread around. They don't have any metabolism. They eat what you make and they replicate with what you have. Tends to be self-limiting. Most viruses, like a cold, you always get over a cold unless you have a really suppressed immune system. You get over things like colds, which are viral infections. They can't replicate on their own. So a virion is a virus stem with a little protective coating around the outside with receptor sites on it that allow it to attach to cells and dump its contents into the cell. If you remember from ANP2, the sperm, which is headed toward the egg, it has lysing agents on the tip, acrosomes they're called, and when it hits the cell, it dissolves just enough that it's able to inject its DNA into the egg. Well, these kind of like that. These are, they're vectors for themselves. And once they go inside the cell, they uncoat themselves, and they start stealing either DNA or RNA. If they're going to steal DNA, they have to go inside the nucleus and start using pieces of your DNA, and you can imagine the damage that does to your own DNA. RNA, they can replicate out in the cytoplasm around the ribosomes that are gathering these RNAs together for protein synthesis. The virus grabs those pieces, those nucleic acids, and uses them to replicate itself. Then it replicates itself as many times as it wants to because it keeps grabbing more and more of your DNA. As long as your cell's still alive, it can, and if it hadn't killed that cell yet, it can take enough material to make multiple virions that will be then released back into the interstitial fluid and bind to adjacent cells and go in there and start the process over again. Some of these guys will replicate and sit there for years and years and years. If you think of, if you've had chicken pox before, you can have shingles when you're old. It's the same virus. It goes inside the cells, and mostly these are nerve cells, and it sits there sometimes for 40 years, 50 years, and then it comes back out and starts attacking the adjacent cells around it, inflames that nerve, and causes the tremendous pain that comes along with shingles. Here we have a virion. It's got a receptor. This cell didn't want to have a receptor for a virus. This virus has learned over millennia that cells have these receptors, and it has developed the ability to be attracted to those particular receptors. And so our host cells, unfortunately, have receptors for viruses, just because the viruses have learned that those receptors exist. Comes in, this is a DNA virus, because it's going inside the nucleus. It's taking DNA to make more of itself. It causes exocytosis, a budding off, and releases virions to go to the next cell and start the process over again. So what does a virus do to you? Well, it screws up your DNA and your RNA. That's pretty much what it does. And those cells become sick. Those cells may die. Those cells may morph into something they weren't supposed to be. If you change somebody's DNA, they're going to be different. And so you have disruption of membranes that might cause the membrane to rupture because now it can't produce the proteins that are needed to keep that membrane intact. The lysosomal membranes, the lysosomes inside the cell, those membranes can get screwed up and they start leaking their digestive juices into the cell and digest the cell. You can transform the cell into a cancer cell. There are a number of viruses that are directly responsible for turning your normal cells into cancer cells and producing cancers. Secondary bacterial infections. When you damage your cells, damage your own, like HIV damages your immune cells. It specifically targets some of your immune cells. Well, if your immune response goes down low enough, you start getting all kinds of other infections, fungal infections and bacterial infections. A lot of people wind up with bronchitis, which is a bacterial problem, after they've had a bad cold, because the immune response in their lungs is screwed up to the point that they start getting infections from bacteria that otherwise couldn't have won. And you can alter the antigens on your own cells. Remember, all cells have molecules on the outside. They're there for other purposes. They're not designed to be antigens, but they're specific to you, and if your cell goes in somebody else, their immune system will attack it because it will recognize it as foreign. Well, viruses, because they alter so many structures within the cell, they can alter those antigens on your own cells so that they're different enough that your immune system recognizes them as being bad guys and comes and starts attacking your own cells. So it can have an autoimmune type response. Couple of viruses. Viral conjunctivitis, so it's causing an inflammation of the lining of the eye. Here we have herpes zoster. It looks kind of like a cold sore. It looks kind of like chicken pox. That's because they're all herpes viruses. But herpes zoster is the one that will come back out as shingles, terribly, painfully, usually a row of blisters along a nerve, and it feels like you've been burned with a blowtorch. Here's our good old vector. Our most common vector for viruses are mosquitoes. Bite somebody that's got a virus, go bite somebody else, and the big problem is mosquitoes don't just suck blood, they inject their saliva into you first, which is an anticoagulant so that you don't clot while they're trying to drink your blood. And when they inject their saliva in you, they inject the virus right into you. Everybody's heard of the Zika virus. It's not being combated as rigorously as it should be. Maybe because mostly its real serious effects are on women, and we have tendency not to work as hard on some populations. But the Zika virus is carried by a mosquito, and it's a mosquito that's out in the daytime all day long. So it's not just an early morning, late evening mosquito that you could hide from if you happen to be a pregnant woman. And the Zika virus was thought to be relatively harmless. It gave you symptoms that were about like a common cold. Some people didn't know they had a virus at all. And yet, it alters DNA, especially in growing fetuses, and increases the likelihood of microcephaly by many, many times. So we've had thousands of children born with microcephaly. Their brain is half the size that it should be. Some of them don't live. Virtually none of them will ever have anything close to a normal life. All they do is just lie there and be alive and scream, and they can't learn, severe retardation, and, terrible burden emotionally and physically and everything on the families. Fungal infections. Now these are kind of interesting. A fungus is really, it's as different from a bacteria as a virus is. It's a different kind of critter. These are eukaryotes because they're actually plants instead of animals. And plants are all eukaryotes. All higher animals are, but bacteria and things like that are not. They can be a yeast, which is a single cell plant, or molds, which kind of grow in branching multicellular structures. Both are fungi, yeasts and molds. They bud off and create new ones, just bud off and, to reproduce. And fungi are everywhere all the time. But our own immune systems and our own healthy bacteria fight them off. Usually we don't have fungal infections. Most people who get fungal infections have some other kind of a problem that's caused an immune suppression of some sort. And as a result, the fungi are opportunistic and manage to take over. It manages to adapt well to a host environment. It can live inside the host for long periods of time, even in tiny numbers that you don't notice, and then takes over if you get really sick or something. It can tolerate big variations of temperature, so fever doesn't hurt it any. Digests keratin, so it dissolves hard stuff like fingernails and toenails. It can live in very low oxygen because it's a plant, and therefore if you get a problem with your leg where you don't have decent blood flow, you don't have good oxygenation, you're diabetic, or you've had some other kind of real vascular problem, fungal infections can thrive with very little oxygen in the tissue. They have ways of suppressing your own immune defense against them. Normally, your own immune system handles them just fine. A fungal disease is a mycosis. Multiple is mycoses. So onycho is finger, so onychomycosis is fingernail fungus or nail fungus. Could be toenail fungus. They can be on the skin, like ringworm on the surface, or it can be opportunistic within tissues. Fungi of the skin, hair, and nails, which are quite common. Scalp fungus, hair fungus, nail fungus, skin fungus, like athlete's foot is a fungus and ringworm is a fungus. Dermato means skin, so dermatophytes are the fungal infections. And specifically, the diseases are called tenias. So you have Tinea corporis. It means on the body, better known as ringworm. Tinea capitis is on your head, in the hair. Tinea pedis on the feet. Tinea cruris, jock itch. All of these are fungal infections. They're very similar, just depending on where they show up. Here we have a couple of fungi. The yeasts are individual cells. The branching fungi are molds. Here's somebody with thrush. Thrush is a fungal infection of the tongue, the back of the throat, the mouth, sometimes halfway down the esophagus. Real painful, hard to get rid of. And you tend to get thrush if you're immune suppressed, like HIV, if you are on long-term antibiotics that kill your bacteria that help control the fungi. Sometimes some kinds of even mouthwashes and things, they suggest rinsing carefully afterward because too much of it has a tendency to encourage the growth of thrush. Here's a couple of those skin infections. Here's Tinea corporis, ringworm. Tinea pedis, there's athlete's foot, between the toes usually. Here's a bacterial infection called impetigo that young kids get. And it looks a lot like ringworm, but this is a bacterial infection. You wouldn't use a fungicide on this. You have to use an antibacterial agent. A heart valve with fungus causing growths on the valve so that it won't close and open properly. Either has to be cured fairly quickly or it has to be replaced. Candidiasis is like a thrush that goes down the GI tract. Perhaps in somebody with HIV or some other really immune suppressed condition. Nail fungus. Vaginal yeast infections, those are fungal infections, have to be treated with fungicides. And fungal infections, because they're hard to kill, can be life-threatening. Not the ones on your skin. Nobody dies from ringworm. But they're opportunistic, and if they cause damage in the area, it prevents blood flow into that area. You can't get your immune system in there, and they are happy to do without blood because they don't need oxygen, and they grow and grow and grow in the lungs and in the GI tract, in the deep tissues. Long-term antibiotics kills good bacteria, makes you prone to fungal infections. Large pH changes. Women have been pretty much advised not to douche regularly because too much of washing out of the vaginal secretions changes the pH of the vaginal tract. And if it's not acidic enough, the fungi can start growing and they get a lot of yeast infections. And finally, we've done bacteria, and we've done viruses, and we've done fungi. So worms are the last of the real major categories. Parasitic infections. A symbiotic parasite may be one that just lives off your food that you haven't digested completely and doesn't actually make you sick. Parasitic ones are ones that are also drinking your blood. None of them are really good. They can be everything from a one-celled protozoan, like an amoeba, or a paramecium. A protozoan, much more complicated animal than a bacterium. This is a real full single-celled animal, all the way to large 6-foot tapeworms. Malaria is a protozoal infection. Amoeba, I got one of these parasitic infections. I was playing in a volleyball tournament in Haiti, and we tried, not hard enough apparently, to avoid drinking water that might have amoeba or something in it. And we were so sick, and we were sick for 6 months after we came back, taking a lot of antibiotics, thinking we had, a typical GI problem like you get when you go to other countries and you're not used to their bacteria. But we finally all had to take antiparasitics before we could get rid of it. It can be spread by mosquitoes. They can spread some, like malaria for sure. Drinking bad water is the most common way of ingesting these little critters. And generally speaking, the way they hurt you is by injecting toxins, producing toxins or inflammatory responses. They have antigens on their surface, so your body will attack them. Remember, eosinophils have the best chance of killing parasites. Here's microscopic worms. And here's a pretty long one. And a lot of really warm weather climates in Central America, South America, Central Africa, there are bot flies and things that will land on you and lay their eggs just under your skin, and you might not even know they were there until suddenly there's a worm coming out of your leg. Now, what kind of signs and symptoms? Depends on what it is. Depends on whether it's a virus, a bacterium, a big worm, a little worm, a fungus, where it is. Is it a yeast infection? Is it thrush? So it depends on whether they create a toxin, whether they take over tissues, whether they cause cancer. There's almost nothing that somebody can't do to you one way or the other, depending on what their possibilities are for wreaking havoc with your body. Fever is common in almost all infections because when your body recognizes these antigens, you send out the cytokines, the interleukins that go to the hypothalamus and raise your temperature. So very common to have a spike in temperature, an increase in neutrophils, inflammatory response if it's local. Pyrogens either from the cell membrane of the organism that is being killed. When you kill a bacterium and release some stuff, some of those pyrogens can be sensed and send the signal. Others are ones that we make ourselves so that our own white blood cells or other immune type of cells, when they're in a battle, will release interleukins and interferons and the like, prostaglandins, and they'll set off your fever mechanism. So we have antibiotics, we have antivirals, we have antifungals, and we have antiparasitics. You have to use the right thing to attack the right creature. Antibiotics come in two general types. One is a bactericide that kills bacteria. The other is bacteriostatic. It means it stops them in their place. It prevents them from reproducing. So it interferes with their ability to split off and reproduce and make more. So eventually your immune system kills them off and you get well. We can develop resistance to antibiotics or any antimicrobial, but especially antibiotics have been a real problem. One problem is that everybody that goes to the doctor who feels really bad wants something. Give me some antibiotics. And doctors try to resist, but it's hard to resist somebody who's really having a hard time. Send them home with a prescription for antibiotics. They're going to get better by a placebo effect anyway, or feel a little bit better because they're taking something, and they'll think you did a great job. The problem is that overuse of antibiotics, often there are a few microbes that manage to survive the treatment, and those are the most resistant to that particular antibiotic. And when they grow and proliferate, now you have a bacterium that is resistant to penicillin or amoxicillin or erythromycin or whatever. And as a result, we have to keep creating new bactericides because people are becoming more and more resistant. Not the people, but their bacteria are more resistant to the ones that we already had. Improper use of antibiotics is a big one. Genetic mutations of bacteria to become resistant to penicillin or something. Multiple antibiotic-resistant bacteria, that's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, has become resistant to most of our antibiotics. Not all of them yet. We can use, they call it Godzillacillin. You know, it's got like everything in it. And we can still control MRSA, not in everybody, but most of the time using these. But we're running out of options for some of these. One thing that they're really concerned about is there are bacteria in South America that they've discovered that they actually respond. I mean, they're killed pretty well by penicillin and things like that, but they're resistant to the one thing that will kill MRSA. And if somehow their DNA gets in our MRSA bacteria and produces a resistance to that last, antibiotic we have, we're really screwed. We're going to have to come up with some yet whole new different thing. And one problem is that antibiotics are not money makers for the pharmaceutical industry. Things like Lipitor are, because people take them their whole life. Diabetes medicines, you take them your whole life. And so the development costs get made up over the years. But if you come up with a Godzillacillin and only a few people need it, and once they take it, they don't need it anymore, the development costs are so high that they're not willing to go through that for a limited number. So it's going to take, literally an act of Congress to get pharmaceutical companies to give them the backing they need, or force them, or whatever it's going to take, to start ramping up their resistant bacteria programs that used to be running a lot more than they are now. It's going to be a big deal for you guys. You're going to be dealing with more and more resistance to these antimicrobials during your medical careers. This MRSA is always on the skin. We normally control it. Our immune system, our own barriers and everything, but it's opportunistic, and if you get sick enough or something happens and it takes over, it's hard to kill. Antivirals, these prevent them from doing their thing in the cell. It's hard to kill a virus that's already there. Your immune system will kill the virus. It will find the virus. It'll make B cells, the plasma cells will make an antibody. It'll attach to that antigen on the virus. Then your neutrophil will go and eat the virus and kill it. Kind of a ponderous process, and it doesn't work great necessarily because the virus may hide inside a cell. But if we can keep the virus from getting into the cell in the first place, then it's out where your immune system can take care of it. Antifungals tend to be fungicides. Some of them are topical, spray-on, Cruex, Decidin, the things that you spray on your foot for athlete's foot. Nail fungus is really hard to control because it's under the nail. There are oral nail fungus fungicides that you can take. They're hard on your liver, so it's kind of a toss-up for people as to whether they want to fight their nail fungus more aggressively and take a chance on liver damage. And vaccines, there are vaccines for bacteria, there are vaccines for viruses. Viruses are the most common vaccines, things like flu, smallpox, measles, mumps. And what they do is they take the virus and they kill it, and then they inject some in you. The antigen is still there. Your body recognizes it. You make the B cells become mature plasma cells, and they release their antibodies, and so everything is cool, and you eat the dead viruses, but you have these memory B cells that hang around, and they're ready the next time the real live virus shows up with the same antigen. You will immediately release the antibodies, and your immune system will kill it before it can go into your cells and make you sick. It's great the way that works. Some things they've had a hard time. They haven't come up with a vaccine for the HIV virus. I'm not sure exactly what the problems are, whether it spends so much time in the cells. I know that it causes damage to your immune system directly, so maybe even putting an antibody on it doesn't do any good if you don't have any T cells to go after it or something. But many things they have managed to control. Flu killed millions of people in the 10s, 20s, 30s, whenever it was that those giant flu epidemics were. Measles killed a lot of people. Diphtheria, mumps, these were not just a childhood disease. Yeah, it was a childhood disease, but my dad he was one of 8 kids, and 4 of them died in childhood. Yeah, childhood disease was a big deal. Polio. When I was a kid, growing up in the 50s, and they had just invented the polio vaccine, everybody got it. Because prior to that, no parents would let their kids go outside in the summer. That's when polio was most likely to be transmitted. And everybody knew kids who had spent time in an iron lung and spent the rest of their life with one leg about 6 inches shorter than the other because polio just destroyed their lives. And the polio vaccine knocked it out like that. Nobody gets polio anymore. So believe me, in those days, people were not worried about the bad effects of vaccines. These saved millions of people. And in fact, there is zero evidence that vaccines cause autism or whatever. It was a couple of British guys who later admitted that they falsified their data to make a name for themselves. And nobody has ever replicated any study that showed that vaccines cause autism. And yet, millions of people, especially in the U.S., who like to believe stuff like that, have decided not to vaccinate their kids for fear they'll become autistic. And some of these diseases that were just about vanished are making a comeback. And if somebody's kid gets polio because they didn't vaccinate them, they're really going to be sad about that. So, yeah, there are kids with immune suppressed systems that can't do vaccines because their own immune response will be so dramatic that it damages them in other ways. But for healthy kids, vaccines are a good thing. In the 1900s, between 1900 and 1910, in that time, life expectancy in the U.S. was about 47 years. And now it's around 80. And the biggest difference is antibiotics and vaccines. Some people are immune deficient. You can have a primary immunodeficiency, meaning you're born with it. You have just an inability to make enough neutrophils, eosinophils, B cells, T cells. You just can't make them. Far more common are secondary or acquired immunodeficiencies. When you get really sick, your immune system is suppressed sometimes, and you then get sicker. You can't fight off something else that might come in. So we have hypogammaglobulinemia. Not enough B cells. You're not making them. T lymphocyte deficiencies. Bone marrow problems or maturation problems in the thymus or in the lymph nodes. Combinations of the two. Severe combined immunodeficiency, SCID. You can have complement defects, particularly in 2 of your 30 or so complement molecules, and therefore your very first response to invasion is blunted, and the ability to send the signals to the second and third order immuno guys is limited as well. Neutropenia, not enough neutrophils. You just don't make enough white blood cells. Even if you get sick, they don't come up in number like they should. Immune deficiencies, the way they present is you get sick and you can't get over it. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Severe recurrent infections that keeps coming back, keeps coming back, keeps coming back. Opportunistic infections, things that most people don't get and you keep getting them. Acquired deficiencies are more common, HIV being the one that we all think of. But you can get these immunosuppressions via a variety of ways. Severe psychological stress, people that are under extreme pressure. If a family member is terribly ill, you have a sick child, and you are afraid they're going to die, the psychological stress. People who are being severely beaten, spouse abuse, child abuse, their immune systems become suppressed and they're more likely to have infections. Dietary insufficiencies, if you don't support your immune system. Cancer causes your immune system to be suppressed. Physical trauma. Some medical treatments, a lot of cancer treatments suppress your immune system. Infections, severe infections can cause immunosuppression, and good old AIDS, HIV. Let's talk about AIDS a little bit, HIV/AIDS. HIV is the virus, human immunodeficiency virus. You can have the virus without having AIDS, just like you can have the MRSA on your skin without having a MRSA in true symptomatics anyway. I mean, the HIV virus actually mainly works by screwing up some of your helper Ts so that your T cells can't turn on your B cells to make antibodies against that virus or any other virus. It's really bad in that way. It also suppresses the activation of some natural killer cells. But you're looking at CD4s, some of the helper cells, and also natural killer cells. If they drop below a certain level, then you are said to have AIDS. 33 million people worldwide in 2008. 56,000 in the U.S. I mean, that's still a lot. They say now that the new medicines have allowed it to become a chronic disease. Yeah, but it's a chronic disease like severe diabetes or something. It's not good to have it. For one thing, you can never have a normal relationship with someone who is free of it without fear of giving it to them, so that is bad. The drugs are expensive, they have side effects, and they don't always work completely. I've known several people with HIV/AIDS. Some of them early on died. Some of them later on lived but got real skinny and kind of struggled. One guy I knew had HIV. He had relationships with someone else who had HIV. They thought they were safe, but the HIV they had was different enough that they both got sicker by getting the other, slightly different HIV virus. Used to be basically 100% lethal. I remember well the onset of the AIDS epidemic. And before they developed any of the antivirals for AIDS, you got it and you were dead in a year. I mean, the friends of mine that I knew in the art fields and stuff, my wife had an art gallery, and we had some good friends that were suppliers to us and stuff, and a couple of them got AIDS, and man, they were gone. It was really grim. Now, it is treatable, controllable, so long as you very carefully take your medicine and monitor your immune system. Now, heterosexual activity is a more common way of getting it than homosexual activity. It was originally a stigmatized thing, saying that only gay men really got it. But now it's more heterosexually transmitted by people from IV drug use, or they picked it up, somewhere, having sex in a country where it was kind of prevalent and they weren't careful, and whatever. Increasing faster in women. The guys have a tendency to go out and get it and come back and give it to their wives and girlfriends. So HIV, first of all, if you have HIV virus, you can have it very early and it doesn't even show up in an HIV test. You have to wait a little while before you take the test, before there's enough HIV to even show up. We had a break-in when my wife and I were living in Atlanta, and some guy broke in the front door and came charging up the stairs. He cut himself when he came through. He came in and shoved my wife, back into the bedroom. She got some of his blood on her. She had some little cuts on her hands. She was so scared. And then he told us, the cops, when they came and hauled him off, that he was HIV positive. And she was so worried. And we had to wait like 6 weeks before she could have the test. And then it turned out she didn't. But, it was kind of a big deal. Later on, it'll show up as you're HIV positive, but you don't have symptoms yet. At these stages, you can still, it's a window of opportunity to take the viral suppressants and basically be healthy. Once you actually have AIDS, it's much more difficult to reverse the process. And AIDS is not a disease, it's a syndrome, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. is a whole variety of problems that happen because of this virus doing damage throughout your body and mainly lowering your immune system, so that you get all sorts of cancers and viruses and things that you normally would be able to fight off. You just can't do it. And generally people who die of AIDS die of cancer or hepatitis or some really severe side diseases that they can't fight off. Severe weight loss with AIDS. Kaposi sarcoma, we'll see that a lot. This is a skin cancer that almost only people with AIDS get. Anybody with a severely suppressed immune system could get it. Herpes simplex viruses that just take off because your body can't control them at all. Cytomegalovirus, well, we're going to see these viruses throughout the course, and this can move into the eyes and cause blindness in the later stages of AIDS. So we have antivirals, highly active antiretroviral therapy, HAART. Sounds really neat. In fact, they know so much about AIDS now, the HIV virus, that we have antivirals that attack like 4 or 5 different places in the process of HIV replication. And it took this before they got a really good effective. They had some antivirals in the 80s and 90s, and they would help for a little while, but they weren't good enough. People would live longer, but they still got really sick and often died. Some of these new drugs preventing the virus from getting into the cell and integrating into the DNA. And they're working on a vaccine. I hope they can. But look at this. Here we have the virion. It's a virus. It's got little receptor things all over it. It binds and injects its DNA, not its DNA. It doesn't have any really exactly. Well, it did from the last virion. Yeah, okay. It came from another cell. So it's got some, but to replicate it, it's got to get some of yours. So it can take, some RNA. It can take some DNA. It has the ability to work on both. So what we have are reverse transcriptase inhibitors. We have entrance inhibitors. We have integrase inhibitors to keep it from getting inside your nucleus. We have protease inhibitors that keep it from making the shell around itself to become a new virion. So all of these different drugs have been developed to interrupt this process of reproducing itself and going back out again. Amazing what science can do if they put their minds to it. How do you tell if your immune system's okay? Well, a complete blood count with differential tells you which white blood cells you have, how many natural killers you have maybe, how many neutrophils you might have. So if you do a really complete count of the different ones, you can see if there's any that are up or down. You can look at your antibodies, your immunoglobulins, see if they are in normal numbers. Skin tests, put a dot on there and see what kind of response you have, whether you already have an immune response, an appropriate immune response to an antigen. Gamma globulin therapy, just giving, some pre-made, basically, antibodies. Stem cell transplantation, if you don't have enough cells making enough white blood cells in your, not that bone, this bone, your bone marrow, You can put in stem cells specifically for the type of cells that you might need made. Transfusion of erythrocytes. If you don't have enough, if you're not making enough red blood cells, or if they're lysing too quickly because there's a hematolysis kind of process going on. Gene therapy to cause you to start making something that you were deficient in making because genetically you were missing the material that it was going to take to do it. And if somebody is immunocompromised, you have to be careful about giving them a vaccine because, again, their immune system cannot respond appropriately, and an inappropriate immune response is likely to make them as sick as the disease would have in the first place. Infections. Thank you.